Now we're going to look at some of the characters from some of the publishers during the golden age of comics. And we're going to start with DC. Of course, several we've already talked about. Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman still are spoken of as the Trinity, the big three of DC Comics. Of course, you've also got Robin there. And the Justice Society, you will recall that some of the, I guess you could say, second string characters, with the big three being the first string. And we also got a glimpse already of the Seven Soldiers of Victory, so you might say that some of those are the third string. Green Arrow I would put at the top of that third string. He should probably be up in the second category. But let's look at some of the others. We'll start with Aquaman. How could we possibly leave him out? Debuted in November 1941 in issue 73 of More Fun Comics, and thereafter appeared frequently in backup stories in Adventure Comics. Remember, we mentioned that before. That was DC's fourth title, and I told you it would be coming back up, and it will yet again. So, anyway, Aquaman, not popular enough to have his own title, nor was he popular enough to be on the cover of Adventure. That was usually someone like Hourman or the Sandman or Green Arrow even, until after World War II, when Superboy became a thing and Adventure Comics became the Superboy vehicle. Okay. Also, from April of 42, in the pages of Star Spangled Comics, you had the Guardian, who was actually a patrol cop who would put on this superhero outfit at night and have this shield. No powers, no superpowers or anything. And he was accompanied by a bunch of kids called the Newsboy Legion that were sort of like his hangers-on. He was created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Then you had Liberty Bell, also never one to merit her own cover. I mentioned her before. She's the one that whenever the Liberty Bell was rung in Philadelphia, she would just get a surge from it. Also, you had Robot Man, who was actually more of a cyborg. He was a guy named Robert Crane, or Bob Crane, who had been shot by bad guys. I think he was he a scientist, or his friend was a scientist? I think it was his friend. Anyway, his brain, before he died, his brain was put into this robot body. So he has the brain of a human and the body of a robot. Now, this is not the same Robot Man from the Doom Patrol, which was from DC in the 1960s. And it's not the same Robert Crane that starred in Hogan's Heroes. The character of Robot Man was co-created by Jerry Siegel and Leo Nowak. Irvin Hassan and Bill Finger. Remember Bill Finger? Co-created Wildcat, who was a former prize fighter who essentially like dresses up in a fuzzy outfit and beats people some more. So Bill Finger got screwed out of credit for Batman, but he does get to have Wildcat. Well, National/DC had their Trinity, or Big Three, and Timely/Marvel had theirs. Captain America, his sidekick Bucky, of course, and the Human Torch and his sidekick Toro, and the Submariner, Prince Namor, who had no sidekick. So these guys we already knew. Let's take a look at some of the B-listers from Timely. Well, on the right here, appearing in Mystic Comics, you have the Black Marvel. And that's an interesting story, kind of convoluted. The Black Marvel is a white guy who got his sacred suit from a Blackfoot Indian, and doesn't have any special powers. And then later, in the 1990s on television, in the Spider-Man animated series, the Black Marvel and several of these other guys made an appearance, and it was revealed in the cartoon that the Black Marvel was a white guy with a black chauffeur that was his sidekick, and that the black chauffeur was actually the Black Marvel. Of course, in the 1940s, nothing like that could have even been conceived of by many of these creators. Over here in Daring Comics, you've got several others. You've got the Finn, who was also created by Bill Everett. Just like the Submariner, Bill Everett liked his aquatic people. And the Thunderer, the Challenger, Captain Daring, and the Blue Diamond. You also had the Whizzer, an extremely unfortunately named really fast person who was secretly Robert Frank. And then you also had Madeline Joyce, alias Miss America, who had super strength and could fly. Later on, these two, the Whizzer and Miss America, were reintroduced into Marvel continuity in the 1970s in their later years, and it was revealed that they had gotten married, and for a while it was believed in the comics that they were the parents of the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, but that turned out not to be the case. But wait, there's more. There is the Blazing Skull, as well as the Black Widow. No relation to the more famous Marvel Black Widow introduced in the 1960s. This Black Widow is a spirit medium whose real name is Claire Voyant. Also, you've got Hercules. You've got the Thin Man, who can smash himself flat as a pancake and roll himself up. Real handy at parties. And here's a guy whose name I was trying to think of earlier, who had preceded Plastic Man as the first stretchy guy, Flexo the Rubber Man. Let's see what was going on over at Quality Comics, where the stars, of course, were the Spirit and Plastic Man. But let's take a look at some of the others, particularly these five, and you'll see why in a moment. You had upper left-hand corner there, appearing in Smash Comics, you had the Ray, who controlled energy and could fly. Then you had the Human Bomb, who could blow things up with his hands, and he had to wear this containment suit so he didn't have any accidents. You also had the Black Condor, appearing in Crack Comics. He could fly, and the reason he could fly, no joke, is because as a little kid his family perished in the Himalayas, and he was rescued and raised by condors. So, of course he can fly. Duh. You also had the Phantom Lady, who could project black light that blinded her enemies. The artist most closely associated with Phantom Lady, although he didn't create her, was Matt Baker, who was one of the few African-American artists working in the comic book industry. The fact is, most of these characters here were either created or co-created by Will Eisner, and the ones that were not were co-created by writers and artists from the Eisner-Iger studio, or the ones who came over with Eisner to Quality, especially Lou Fine. Lou Fine was involved with the Ray, the Black Condor, and Uncle Sam. There on the lower right-hand corner, Uncle Sam, the personification of America, kind of a crusty, Holmesy, Abe Lincoln type character that had super strength and liked to wrestle. And finally, there in the lower center, Doll Man, who could shrink down to just a few inches high. He couldn't shrink down to like teeny tiny, microscopic level, but he could get down to just a few inches. Now, eventually, in the early 1950s, Quality Comics goes under. A lot of companies do around that time. And like many of the companies that go under, their characters are bought up by DC Comics. So a lot of the characters we've looked at from other publishers wind up being owned by DC. And DC introduced these 5 characters into the DC universe in the 1970s as the superhero team, the Freedom Fighters, who interacted with the Justice Society and with the Justice League. Now, in this new revised version, they're on an alternate Earth where the Germans won World War II and they're part of the Resistance. Finally, let's talk about this guy, Midnight, created by Jack Cole, the Plastic Man guy. Now, you might think that Midnight looks just like the Spirit, but you'd be wrong, because actually Midnight looks, acts, and talks just like the Spirit. The fact is that in late 1941, Will Eisner was drafted, right? The draft had been instituted, and America might be getting involved in the war, so he got drafted and he went off to serve. And Busy Everett, owner of the company, was terrified that his cash cow was going to get shot or something, and there would go a lot of his income flow, particularly since not only was the Spirit as done by Will Eisner very popular, the Spirit couldn't be done by anybody but Will Eisner. That was part of the agreement. So we can't have the Spirit. Let's have somebody that's in the spirit of the Spirit. And so Jack Cole was assigned by Busy Everett to create something as close to the Spirit as possible. And so he did. Now the origins are different and all that stuff, but the techniques are pretty much the same. When the war was over and Will Eisner came back, not having been shot, in fact he spent the war illustrating technical manuals for the Army. He picked right back up with the Spirit where he left off, and Midnight just kind of faded into the night. Here's a company we've only mentioned once so far in passing, Lev Gleason Publications, owned by Lev Gleason, whose choice in company titles displayed kind of a lack of imagination. His company was not one of the big ones. In fact, they were kind of second string. He'd gotten his start under Harry Wildenberg as advertising guy for Eastern Color Printing, where Max Gaines was also working for Harry Wildenberg. Then Gleason got into the comic strip syndicate business, and then he bought his first comic book, launched his first comic book, Tip Top Comics, in 1939. But these were the 2 big hits that Lev Gleason had, both of them closely associated with their star artist, Charles Biro. We'll be talking about Biro a little bit more later. Daredevil was the big superhero at Lev Gleason Publications. Silver Streak was another, and there were a handful of others. But Daredevil was actually a hit. No connection, like I said before, to the 1960s Marvel Daredevil. Now, Biro hadn't created Daredevil. He came in several issues in, but his artistic style became closely associated with the character. The character was actually created by Jack Binder and Don Rico, and then with they were only on it for 1 issue, and then Jack Cole was brought in. This is before he went to work for Quality, and he redesigned the character basically from scratch, giving him his final look that we see there. So, character's introduced in September 1940. This issue, where he's fighting Hitler, is from July 1941, which means he was several months behind the timely heroes fighting Hitler, but a couple of months ahead of the DC ones. Bureau's big hit, though, that started in 1942 was not a superhero comic at all. It was a crime comic. In fact, it was really the first crime comic, the first in a genre. It was a few years ahead of its time. The crime genre would come in big in the late 1940s. And Bureau was, like I said, the star artist for that, as he eventually became also for Daredevil. In fact, what we're going to do later is we are going to look at various genres within comic books starting in the 1940s and look at, kind of follow through each of those genres from, crime, science fiction, horror, romance. So it seems like we're dwelling very heavily on superheroes, which we are right now. But the industry is going to take a turn, and we'll talk about Crime Does Not Pay and Charles Bureau and all these other things at that time. And the rest, as they say here on Gilligan's Isle. So you had The Masked Marvel from Centaur Publications, who was very popular. Centaur was the home of Amazing Man by Bill Everett, you'll recall. You had The Hangman from MLJ. You had Airboy by Hillman Periodicals, which lasted well into the 1950s. So now, The Hangman, that's number 8 pictured there of his own series, first appeared in Pep Comics, which was MLJ's main title. And here you can see the cover of Pep Comics number 17, in which MLJ's star superhero, The Shield, is introducing the newest sensation, comics' newest sensation, The Hangman. There's something very interesting about this character and about this comic. You see, for the first 16 issues, the backup stories starred the Comet. But in issue 17, the Comet's brother discovers his secret identity, and then, shortly afterward, witnesses the Comet being murdered by gangsters. So the brother adopts the identity of the Hangman to go out and get revenge, making the Comet the first superhero to lead a feature, even though he didn't have his own title, the first superhero to be killed in action. And by the way, if you couldn't read the tiny writing above Hangman, I have it expanded for you up there so you can see exactly, you rats, just exactly what's going on with the Hangman. Another popular character was this guy, the Blue Beetle, who was kind of like the Guardian, a policeman by day and a hero by night, due to his special vitamin 2X pills that gave him super energy. He was created a little bit ahead of the curve of many of the others in August 1939, and was popular enough that he had his own weekly radio serial. That is not breakfast cereal, but a radio serial. Created by Charles Bukowski and appearing in Fox Publications. Now, Fox, this all becomes kind of convoluted. Remember Phantom Lady from Quality Comics? Well, Quality sold that character off to Fox in the mid-1940s. So then Phantom Lady became a Fox character, and that's when she was drawn by Matt Baker. Then in 1954, Fox went out of business, and all their superhero characters were sold to Charlton Comics, who were actually around since 1940, but didn't really have any huge hits during the Golden Age. So the Blue Beetle goes from a Fox character to a Charlton character, whereas the Phantom Lady had gone from a Quality character to a Fox character to a Charlton character. Now, Charlton sort of came into their own in the 1950s and especially the 60s. But eventually they faltered as well. And in 1983, all the Charlton characters were sold to DC, so that the Blue Beetle became a DC character. And the Phantom Lady must have, maybe she didn't become a Charlton character. She got bought up by DC earlier. Anyway,
well, I had
by the
to go
1980s,
back
the Blue Beetle
Phantom Lady
was
straightened
a
out in
DC
my head,
superhero.
so.
Here goes. Phantom Lady originally appeared in Quality Comics in 1941. Then, in 1946, Phantom Lady was sold to Fox Comics, where she was a Fox Comics star. Then Fox went out of business in 1954, and all the Fox characters were sold to Charlton. But 2 years before that, in 1952, Fox had sold Phantom Lady off early to Star. So when the Blue Beetle went from Fox to Charlton, the Phantom Lady had already gone to Star. But then Star went out of business after just a year or two. And so Star sold Phantom Lady to Ajax Farrell in 1954, where she had her own title for 4 years. And then in 1958, Ajax Farrell went out of business, and they were bought by Charlton. So the Phantom Lady went from Ajax to Charlton, where she joined the Blue Beetle that she had once been with at Fox, but who had been at Charlton already for 4 years. So for the next several years through the 1960s, the Phantom Lady has her own title from Charlton Comics. But then, around 1970, DC Comics made a clarification. Now, you see, they had, in the late 50s, they had bought all the original Quality characters. DC had bought Plastic Man, the Spirit, and the others. And so they were saying that, according to the deal they made at the time, it was for all the original Quality characters. Therefore, Phantom Lady should never have gone to Star and Ajax Farrell and Charlton, because DC had already bought her. So guess what? DC's bigger. And so 1973, the Freedom Force I talked about earlier, with all those Quality heroes, are introduced to the DC universe, kind of, sort of, because they're in an alternate dimension. In 1973, guest starring in the Justice League. Then 1976, got their own title, the Freedom Fighters. But then after the crisis on Infinite Earths that we'll talk about later on in the mid to late 1980s, characters who were on, quote, Earth X, the Freedom Fighters, were brought into the regular DC universe to interact with Superman and so forth. So now Phantom Lady is at DC, where she joins, guess who? The Freedom Fighters. There. That's simple enough, isn't it? Anyway, interesting as all that is, let's get back to Fox Publications, which was established by Victor Fox, who was born in Nottingham, England, to Russian Jewish parents who had immigrated to England, where they stayed just for a short while, and when he was 3 in 1896, they moved to the United States. Now, in the years before the golden age of comics began, Fox had been involved in several things, including various accusations, and by accusations I mean occasional arrests for fraud and bribery. And he had started operating in magazines, mainly astrology magazines. And he's one of the entrepreneurs who saw an opportunity to jump in on the ground floor after the success of Superman, and founded Fox Publications in August 1939. And he got an office in the same building where Harry Donenfeld had his building. The difference was that Fox's office was basically Fox, because he outsourced all the work through the Eisner and Iger studios. Two of the first people that became involved were Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, and this is just literally months before they came on board Marvel Comics. Simon came over as an editor for the Fox publications. So this is what Simon and Kirby had to say about the brief period of time they worked for Victor Fox. First, a quote from Jack Kirby. Victor Fox was a character. He'd look up at the ceiling with a big cigar, this little fella, very broad, going back and forth with his hands behind his back, saying, "I'm the king of the comics! I'm the king of the comics!" And we'd watch him and, of course, smile a little because he was a genuine type. Simon told a similar story, talking about how Fox had started his own company, and he said, quote, "I happened to get a job. I went over to Fox and became editor there, which was just an impossible job because there were no artists, no writers, no editors, no letterers, nothing there. Everything came out of the Eisner and Iger shop." And he was a very strange character. He had kind of a British accent. He was like 5'2". Told us he was a former ballroom dancer. He was very loud, menacing, and really a little scary guy. He used to say, "I'm the king of the comics, I'm the king of the comics, I'm the king of the comics." We couldn't stop him. So if you've ever wondered who's the king of the comics, well, there you go. All right, well, not all the Golden Age heroes were superheroes. There were, still some regular adventure characters, like, for example, from Adventure Comics, Paul Kirk, Manhunter, who's kind of a private eye sort of fella. Also from All American Comics, that would later be merged into DC, you had Hop Harrigan, who was a heroic pilot. And there were also, of course, other genres, the funny animal genre that we'll be talking about separately a little bit later. But there's one character that I definitely want to mention while we're in the Golden Age, and that is the Heap, which was a swamp creature that was a backup in Airboy comics and various other things from Hillman periodicals. The Heap it's kind of a shambling, shaggy, mossy creature that would make a big impression on some people and would influence some other characters about 30 years later.